Welcome, everyone. As you can see from the agenda, we have a lot of material to cover. This is a huge body of information. So we'll try to get through this very clearly and carefully as we go ahead. There are a number of slides here in this particular deck, but you'll have that as a reference point later on to go back. We're going to talk about FDA compliance and oversight, an overview of policies and procedures, computer system validation overview, and then we'll talk about planning and execution and operations and maintenance. We'll finally get to some GXP documentation principles, policy and procedure checklists, some industry best practices, and a recap followed by a Q&A. Now, companies have a very good reason, many good reasons for meeting FDA compliance. And certainly you want to be in compliance, but you want to focus on your data integrity because that's going to lead to product quality and customer safety. It'll also provide you with a way of having more efficient business operations. You don't have to repeat things if you do them right the first time. And of course, good relations with FDA and a positive image and reputation are certainly wanted by all companies. Now, the FDA operates on two very key premises that are really something to keep in mind as we go through this entire presentation. If you didn't document something, you didn't do it. So there has to be evidence. You have to be able to prove that work was done with hard evidence to support your case during inspection or audit. The second is that if you could have committed fraud, you did commit fraud. And for example, if you're an analyst and you enter information or data into a system, and there's no audit trail, then someone comes along to review it and they perhaps change that data. There's no audit trail to track that change. You don't know who made the change, what the original value was, why they made the change, or when it was made. There's an opportunity for fraud. If you don't have any kind of technical or procedural controls in place, you clearly could be at fault here, even if you're not doing anything wrong. The FDA will view it that way. With FDA, there's no recourse. You're innocent until proven guilty in a U.S. court of law, but not with the FDA. And the consequences can be very severe. They can issue fines, confiscate your materials, and shut down your operations. That can be extremely costly, both to your bottom line and your reputation. The classic example is Sharing Cloud Consent Decree that was issued by FDA in 1998. It cost them $500 million, $500 million in fines. It resulted in them having to shut down more than one of their manufacturing plants, parts of some plants. And it took them about 10 years to recover from those losses. So it really can be quite devastating for a company. Now we're going to be talking about how you can support your computer system validation efforts. And that's going to be for all of your FDA-regulated systems. Those are GXP systems, or systems that are based on FDA predicate rules or governed by FDA predicate rules. With GXP, the X being variable, we have good manufacturing, good laboratory, and good clinical practices. So you have to remember that in addition to computer system validation and having all your policies and procedures in place and doing things the right way, you always have to reflect back on the GXP, that the practices that apply to your particular area, and make sure you're in line with those as well. And we're talking about both IT and automated systems. IT systems being those applications with functionality that user interacts with. Automated systems are more the monitoring and controlling types of systems that are used for manufacturing or laboratory equipment or instrumentation. Any FDA-regulated product that is touched by one of these systems, the systems used to develop, produce, test, store, or distribute the product, has some relevance in terms of the data to that product, have to be validated according to good computer system validation practices. And these are just some of the examples of areas that would touch particular data, systems that would touch key processes in your organization that would be FDA regulated. And next we have some specific examples, such as lab systems, clinical data management systems, and so forth. And don't forget the monitoring and automation systems in your manufacturing and laboratory areas. And also your enterprise resource planning systems. Many companies make the mistake of validating a laboratory system in their quality control unit and then interfacing it to a large ERP system that handles all of their enterprise resource and requirements planning. But they don't adequately validate the ERP segment. There's no validation of the transfer of data or information. And if you're going to be making decisions from data coming from a laboratory system, for example, that a product can be released to distribution, you want to make sure it's being made from a system that's been validated. So if the ERP is used, you need to validate that system as well. And also note any interfaces or integration points of systems. So if your system is going to be interfaced to any other system in the organization, you have to evaluate and assess what kind of interaction there is, what kind of transfer of instructions or data or files, and make sure that all of that is validated and verified. Now let's look at policy and procedures. These are two very distinct types of documents. They address related subject matter, but different levels and different types of content for each. A policy is a very high-level document that specifies what. It indicates what an organization is directed to do. The procedure is more specific and specifies how that what should be carried out. Policies will include statements like must or shall. Procedures will include specific steps to how to do that. Both are living documents. These should be managed as part of your quality management system, stored in a controlled repository with unique identification numbers assigned to them and using templates that are standard within your organization. You should have a standard policy and a standard procedure template. And these should also be reflected in a procedure for how to create a policy and how to create a procedure. You want to make sure that these are all created in a standard way with a standard format and are done consistently. You also want to make sure that they're all available as current copies of these. People that have access to them should only be able to pull up a PDF version that's a current version. And if it's printed, take care to put a note at the bottom that noting that this particular copy is only good for 24 hours and have a time and date stamp. Too often, the FDA picks up on companies where users in the environment, employees are using copies of a policy or procedure that were printed out even 6 months or a year ago and are no longer valid. They may be similar to what's in there today, but if they're not working from the current copy, they're going to get cited by FDA. Policies provide rules and guidelines under which to operate, and they link to procedures that are developed to show steps for how to meet those rules and guidelines. By doing this, we ensure consistency and compliance with your strategic direction. And we also explain what's required and why, who's responsible for execution and enforcement. Those should all be included in your policy and procedure statements. Procedure qualities are developed from business rules and guidelines under which to operate, and as delineated by a policy. Every procedure should point to one or more policies in your organization. They should have specific instructions or steps that aren't required to perform a task or part of a process. You can take the form of a work instruction instead of a procedure as well. A WI or work instruction, a quick reference guide, a QRG, or any other type of detailed set of instructions can be used in place of a specific procedure. In cases where we talk about manufacturing, where there are very, very detailed and elaborate steps that have to be taken, often these are deemed to be work instructions, but that's something for your company to choose. The template should provide the consistency and should have very specific required content. If there is a section that is not relevant to a particular document, document, it should be noted as NA not applicable or none. Nothing should be left out. You can also add relevant information included as a new section or an appendix, as long as you're not changing the intent and the content of the template as a control document, and you don't have authority to do that unless you are the editor. In both types of documents, you have to have key information. A header is usually done that has the title, which is descriptive. A document number, that's a unique identifier. There should be a document numbering system used through your quality management system that identifies something as a policy or a procedure, and perhaps in a particular functional area. There should be an effective date, the date upon which this policy or procedure takes effect. It should supersede another document, or if it's a new document, it should be indicated as none. There's no replacement. Every page should be numbered as page X of N, using that numbering convention. Any other identification information should also be included. There should be an approval table with the printed name, ensuring that it's very clear who did the document itself, the author, who reviewed it, who approved it. The title indicates the authority to make one of those actions, and the signature indicates the action was taken. Prepared by, reviewed by, approved by. And the date should also be included and should be done in the format that's standard in your company, whether that's MMDDYYYY or some other format. There should also be a version history table with a printed name that provides clarity as to who made any kind of change to this particular document. The title of the person indicates their authority to make that change, and the signature indicates that the change was made, and the date on which it was made is added. Every page has to stand on its own, and the document to which it belongs should be identifiable. You want to have a purpose showing what is going to be accomplished by following this particular policy or procedure, and the scope, what does it apply to and what is not applicable, and references. So for example, with your procedures, these should reference one or more policies. A policy doesn't link down to a procedure in the sense of pointing to it. The document should always point upward, procedure to a policy, and a policy to perhaps an external document, maybe even an FDA guidance document. Acronyms can be used, and there should be a section so that these are conveniently looked upon by someone reading it and can know exactly what they mean. And key terms should also be used with definition of each. You want to make sure that people are going to understand what you mean when you use particular words or phrases. The policy-specific content, the overview, will include key information explaining why you need this particular policy. The policy statement will be what the behavior is that's required by you in the organization. Procedure-specific content will include the procedure or steps to carry out the complete set of tasks or the activity involved. And the standard format for the document numbering system. Typically, you'd want to use a department, the document type, the sequential number, and the document version to be included somehow in your schema or format for your standard number. As an example, an initial version of a quality procedure might be QAS-001-00. The first revision would end in 01 instead of 00. Very simple to follow. Now, computer system validation began in 1983 when FDA issued the Blue Book, or the guidance for computer system validation. It's the process for assuring, very simply, that a system does what it purports to do. In other words, you have to have a clear and specific set of requirements, and then you have to thoroughly test and validate that those requirements are met through test scripts. It's based on the standard System Development Life Cycle Methodology, or SDLC for computer systems. because it's important to make sure that you not only validate your system, but maintain it in a validated state throughout its entire life cycle. The SDLC framework helps you support your GXP system validation. It's integral to CSV. And it starts when you select your system, you implement and maintain it, and all the way through until you retire it from cradle to grave. It's a series of life cycle phases that can be identified, and there are specific deliverables and processes that have to happen at each phase. It also helps to have a validation strategy in place based on a series of policy and procedure templates that can assure consistency. So you want to have a policy that says this organization will validate every system that's regulated by FDA, every GXP system. You'll also have a procedure for how to go about that validation that takes into account all of the life cycle phases through retirement. Now, some people break these up into different topics. The content, where it's located, is not as important. What's really important is that you have all of that content covered somewhere. And as you can see with the computer system life cycle, you start with your planning, analysis, design, development, integration, and testing, and you implement your system and put it into production. But on the upper left side, when you go into maintenance mode, there are still some things you have to do to make sure that you are maintaining your system in a validated state. And this should be guided by specific policies and procedures for that purpose. But once your system's in production, that's not the end. You'll have upgrades, updates, enhancements, changes of all sorts. And when you do that, you'll have a standard change control process, which will start you off with your new set of planning, analysis, and so forth around the circle. You want to make sure that when you're changing anything to the system, it's done under a strict change control method. You should have a change control procedure that dictates exactly how you go about doing this. What kind of an analysis, assessment do you do to make sure you fully understand the impact of this change on the system and on its validated state? And then you do whatever testing is necessary to make sure that when it goes into production again, it will be working properly and will not have any impact on the system as it was. All of this, of course, has to be documented. The key elements of the life cycle methodology, it starts with the validation plan. This is includes in part a risk assessment and mitigation. And user requirement specification should lead you to understanding what kind of system you're looking for in order to select one. Now, user requirement specification, the URS, is very high level, user language, and it's sort of a first step where the user or business owner defines what it is they're looking for in terms of functionality. You use that to start thinking about the type of system you want. And once you have a system selected or at least identified one or more systems that could fit the bill, you then go into your validation plan, which should include a complete risk assessment and mitigation, which we'll go into more detail in a bit. And then after your URS, you want to break that down into detailed functional requirement specification. These are specific things that the system has to do, and they should be unique and testable. The system specification, the requirement specification, tells you what the system will do. The system design specification tells you how it will deliver that. It could also be a configuration design specification if it's a configurable system. The difference is system design is for coded systems, so where you have unique code written, if you have custom code being developed, you'll have a system design specification showing how that code will be developed or how it will be delivered. In case of a configuration design, the configurable systems are those that you can change the configuration of. In other words, you can set certain parameters to certain values and turn features on and off. It's sort of a system that you get where you can have various options to choose from for different features. You want to make sure you understand what kind of system you have and what kind of documentation is required. And again, all of this should be in your validation procedures, stepwise showing each phase. The next phase is implementation, where you install or actually configure your software or custom develop it. You'll then go into testing, where you have a test protocol or plan for each of 3 phases of testing: the installation, operational, and performance qualification, IQ, OQ, and PQ. PQ sometimes being called user acceptance testing or UAT. The test protocol should specify specific test cases and scenarios. How are you going to be using this system? Particularly in the OQ and PQ, you're going to be putting together cases and scenarios for how the system will be used, what functionality will be tested, and specific test scripts to make sure every requirement is thoroughly tested. Test summary reports should be developed as well. So you'll want a test summary report for each phase, or one that covers all 3 phases. Either way is acceptable. And again, your validation plan should lay out all of these deliverables as part of the planning effort. You're going to deliver all of these things. Your validation procedure is going to give you a template that will show you how step-by-step to do validation, starting with planning and progressing through all of these deliverables. And the validation procedure should include a template for each one of these. Anywhere you need a protocol or a report or some type of log or any kind of recording device, you want to make sure that that's available as a template in your procedure so that you do things consistently. A configuration management plan is also important, because at the end of your implementation, you want to have a frozen copy of what the configuration looks like, if it's configurable. All of this should be under strict change control. Each one of the deliverables should be done in the right chronological order and sequence. And you should progress to each one when you've fully accepted the results of the one prior. After you're putting your system, or you've tested your system and you've approved the results and written your summary reports, you want to do a system acceptance form. This is a contract basically with the users saying they accept the system as it is functioning, as it was tested. They believe the system does what it purports to do, and they should sign off on that. The system release notification is something the steward of the system will issue, the IT organization or whoever is maintaining your system. It could also be in the cloud. You want to make sure that you know exactly when the system is released for production, so that you know the point of time in which data becomes valid data. Any data collected after that point in time is valid data. You'll also have, it's not on this list, but there's also a validation summary report that indicates that everything you said you would do in your validation plan has been done and was successful, and you've met everything required. The summary report should be the last thing before you put your system into production. Once your system's in production, you have to be able to maintain it in a validated state. So operational maintenance and support procedures are critical. And this is where there's a lot of specific issues with IT organizations in particular that don't have validation training or GXP type training, where they don't understand what they need to do in order to prove the system is maintained in a validated state and how to document that. Now, a question came up about daily or more frequently than daily. How do you deal with frequent releases? Well, if you're talking about functionality of the system in terms of a release, you really need to test any changes made to the functionality before putting it into the system, putting it into the production environment. So it would depend on what you mean by frequent releases. Anything that's daily or more frequently than daily would be unusual in one of the GXP systems that I can think of. So, for example, a laboratory system, a manufacturing system. Now, there may be things like patches to security or things like that that would come up all the time. Things that are rooted in your operating system in your environment, in your infrastructure. These are the standard changes that are made to an environment that could happen daily or frequently. And those are the types of things that you might do an assessment and say, for all of these types, we're going to go ahead with the changes, the patch, the security patch, and just monitor and make sure that things are going okay and nothing's been disrupted. It's only when you're really changing something about your code, your functionality, that you need to really consider doing a complete assessment and either testing the change and even revalidating if necessary, if the changes are that significant. But once your system is validated, you want to make sure that you have those operational maintenance and support procedures. Now, if you have a cloud service, so software as a service, SaaS applications, they can be modified, as someone just indicated, by the vendor at any time, including new features being added. And that's true. You don't have control over that. But what you need to do is understand through release notes for each change what exactly they're changing and whether or not that's going to impact your functionality. If it's simply a new release because of a technology change or some type of security patch, that would be something you wouldn't have to worry about so much, and you could accept that without any issue. It's when you're getting into the actual functionality of your application that you need to worry. If anything is changing in functionality, you need to change your functional requirements, update them, and then change your design or configuration specification to match that, and then come up with whatever testing you need to do to test the new change, and even some regression testing if you need to test to make sure there's no impact on the other code in the system. So you have to do an evaluation each time. But if this is going to be done by your vendor routinely, and if it's not something that's going to change the functionality of your system, there's less of a need to worry about that. Now, one way you handle that as well is in your installation qualification. So you're going to make sure that your server is provisioned correctly, your software is installed properly, all of your application software, your operating system, database software, utilities. These are all things that get built as you begin putting in a new system. Now, if you have the software, the server on your premises and have control over everything, you can do a standard installation qualification and document everything as it's being installed. But if you have something that's in the cloud and you're at the mercy of the provider or the host server, you have only the ability to make sure that you've fully vetted that vendor who is providing the host service. Is it Oracle, Amazon Web Services, or some other reliable vendor? Have you done a vendor audit or a vendor questionnaire sent to them? Have you explored the internet and made sure that they follow trusted practices? All of the documentation that you can gather to support that should be part of your IQ if it's an SaaS application. Now, disaster recovery and business continuity are important. You need to know what to do if the system were to be hit with some kind of disaster and taken offline or somehow corrupted. You want to know how are you going to bring that back into the state it was in before the disaster hit. The business continuity plan tells you what to do in terms of your operation while the system is not available. Will the business keep running? Is it a critical business operation that needs to continue 24/7? Are you going to collect data on paper or an Excel spreadsheet or some other media? You need to make those plans and know how you're going to deal with that at the time. Periodic review is also necessary because you need to look every year at least at your system and assure that it is still maintained in a validated state. And you might do this more often if you have a significant change, but at least annually, you should look at all the security logs, the records of access, look at the preventive maintenance that was done, any kind of changes, change control records. All of that should be evaluated. And part of your procedure should be to have a periodic review assessment, a checklist of some kind, step by step how you go about doing that each year, for each system, who does it and how they do it and why they do it. And then you also want a periodic review report so that at the end of the year you can put out a report or statement saying the system, in our estimation, based on what we found during our review, remains in a validated state. The system retirement is the end of the life of the system. What's important here is that you understand the data and retention period. If there's data still remaining on the system that is within its retention period, you need to keep that data viable through the end of the retention. To do that, you may need to keep the system sort of on the side and available if you needed to bring it up and show FDA. Otherwise, if the system is no longer viable or supported and you would feel much better or safer putting that data on some other media, you can do that as well. You can archive it somehow, but you must verify that it's in fact the original data. So the key takeaway is that validation isn't a one-time event. You have to maintain it in a validated state until the system no longer has a life and the data no longer has a life. You have to support it with that additional set of policies and procedures for maintaining the system in a validated state. Now, when you start the validation of a particular system, you want to have a standard policy and procedure that guides you. This particular set should encompass every life cycle phase in the validation effort. Now, it could be broken down into multiple procedures to even put a procedure for each life phase or life cycle phase. Some people do that. Other people create one very large validation procedure that covers every single phase. It can get pretty cumbersome, so some of them may want to be used as independent documents. It depends on how often you think you might be changing that, and you want to be able to make this something you can maintain easily. And while it's important that you know the necessary content in policies and procedures, how you create that document is less important and less critical, as long as you can show FDA that the content is there. So the validation policy can be a simple statement saying all GXP systems should be validated, and also that they should be maintained in a validated state throughout their lifetime. The validation procedure, again, could be one procedure with every life cycle phase or broken down into multiple procedures. The procedure or procedures should point directly back to the validation policy, and it should also include the standard templates used to ensure a consistent approach is taken, which will reduce your time and effort and make sure you're appearing to FDA to be running a consistent operation. The procedures should all point to the validation policy. The validation policy might point to a particular FDA guidance for computerized systems. If there are electronic records and signatures involved, you'll want to point to that particular guidance, which is 21 CFR Part 11. So depending on what you're doing, you may have pointers going to different types of guidances from FDA. So again, the first step is to identify what functionality is needed. This is at a very high level. You want to look at some software packages to perform the application. Very rarely are people writing custom code today, at least from scratch. But there are some organizations that do have legacy systems that are custom coded and maintained by their internal IT people. You may have a mix of those things. A typical company is sort of a hybrid of these types of packages and in-house systems. And until you evaluate different packages to perform the functions that are needed, you need to have that high-level standard. You need to know exactly what the user is looking for. The requirements should be gathered in the user requirement specification, the URS. That should be written in business terminology by the subject matter experts and should be the basis for evaluating different packaged software. The URS will also serve as the basis for developing detailed functional requirements. Your FRS should break up the URS elements into very specific requirements for the user. Now, the URS could be the subject of its own procedure, or it could be included in your overall validation procedure. Again, you want to do this at a high level in business terminology, and you want the users to agree to this, that this is what they're looking for. It should also be maintained as a current or living document so that you know when changes are made, if the user is going in a different direction, for example, or wants to add some type of function. It should be captured here. Now, once you identify your system, go through your selection process, the next step is to actually write in detail your validation plan for the system. Now, you can start the validation plan at the beginning, indicating, and if you have a template, it makes it much easier through your procedure, indicating all of the life cycle phases that you'll have to take into account during the validation effort, until you know that whether you're going with a particular package or maybe even doing an in-house solution, it's difficult to know exactly what steps or what validation life cycle phases will be covered. But anyway, when you do your URS, that will tell you, that will help you pick a package, and that will help you decide on what your validation plan should look like. And then you want to start looking at who are the users of the system? What are they using it for? How are they going to implement and validate all of this work? How are they going to implement and validate the system and manage all those activities? Do you have any prerequisites for starting this whole effort? Is there any training required ahead of time? Is a vendor going to be involved in the implementation and or the validation? Sometimes it's done by internal resources, but sometimes vendors, contractors, and other outside resources are pulled in to help out. And then you want to know what's your overall company approach. And again, your standard validation policy and validation procedure will help define this. And you want to know what rationale you're going to use to demonstrate the system is fully tested and validated to meet FDA compliance. Who's going to be involved, and do you have the policy and procedures in place to support your effort? Now, in your validation plan, you need to develop a rationale for how you're going to approach validation and testing. There are several factors that should be included in making that determination. One of them is risk. The FDA doesn't have enough staffing to inspect every system at every company. They're going to come to your site and likely will ask you for a list or an inventory of all of your GXP systems. And that could be hundreds of systems. But you should have some kind of Excel spreadsheet or other way of recording all of your GXP systems. Now, each one, if it's properly validated, will have undergone, during the validation process, a complete risk assessment. Based on that risk assessment, it'll determine how risky it will be to a product, a process, or a patient if the system were to fail. A standard system risk approach should be used by the company to do this, and that could be the subject of a separate procedure for risk assessment. The validation procedure should indicate that a risk assessment should be done as part of the plan. The approach should be based on a carefully thought out rationale. So look at each system, look at your particular system. If the system were to fail, what impact would that have on the process or the product and ultimately the patient? There are many different ways that a system could fail. You want to identify risk scenarios based on typical processes and operations in your environment. You want to look at what's the severity if a specific risk does happen. So say you identify 10 different scenarios where the system could be at risk, it could fail. You want to look at each one of those and determine the severity of the impact if it were to happen, the likelihood or probability if the scenario did happen, or of this scenario happening. You want to assess how detectable the risk would be. If it did occur, would you know it? And then identify any ways you have to mitigate each of those risks. So you look at each risk And so, as I said, you might have 10 risk scenarios. You could have any number. And when you look at the severity, likelihood, detectability, and mitigation of each one, you should be able to come up with some kind of a process, whether that's a scale of some kind, in order to be able to identify each system and the risk associated with its failure relative to all the other systems. So your risk approach has to be a consistent, standard way, a standard scale of measure that's relative. And you can come up with any one you want for your company, but it should be defined in a procedure for risk assessment. Or, again, it should be part of your validation plan and part of your validation procedure. Now, based on all of the risks taken collectively for a particular system and what their values are, you should be able to come up with an overall risk profile for a particular system. How risky is it to put this system in place and use it for the function that we plan to use it for? What if it fails? Is that going to happen? And is it going to be harmful to a product, a process, or a patient? A consistent approach to determining the risk should be done in a standard way and should be defined in a procedure. Now, the FDA will ask you to not only have that inventory of GXP systems, but they should be prioritized based on the risk assigned to them or level of potential risk assigned to them. The approach that you take to validating each system should include testing that's done in a way that will assure that that risk is minimized. So the risks that are posed are the things that you definitely want to test very thoroughly and robustly. In addition to risk, there are several other things to take into account when you're deciding on how to plan your validation testing. And your validation plan is the place where you define that particular approach or rationale. You have to be able to defend that to FDA. In addition to risk, you certainly want to look at size and complexity of the system and the criticality of the particular function to the business. But another area you need to look at is what type of system are we talking about? What's the category? Now, GAMP5, through the International Society of Pharmaceutical Engineers, or ISPE, has come up with a way of categorizing your products to make sure, or your software applications, to make sure that you're testing each in accordance with the level of complexity of that particular type of application. Any condition that a drug conditions that drug products are exposed to have to be accurately recorded. So your system has to capture the data in a way that's going to reflect what's really going on. Any other system, again, that's touched by a computer or an automated system also has to be validated. Now, GAMP5 provides concepts for how you can improve your existing validation methodology. And it makes sure that your system is fit for the intended use and meets regulatory requirements. It's built on industry good practice, and it's an efficient and effective way to do this. So it's something worth referencing or looking at. It's not a prescriptive method or standard, but it provides you with some pragmatic guidance and some approaches and tools for how to go about doing this. But of course, all of your validation effort has to be done in a way where you're applying these and also using your expertise and your good judgment. And these are just showing that GAMP5 compliance objectives are aligned with any company's compliance objectives. Now, GAMP5 shows 5 categories. Operating systems are the lowest level. Operating systems, operating software, your database software, tools and utilities. In category 2, we go to instruments and controllers where we have a little more complexity. You might have some kind of calibration or configuration capability. In category 3, it's an off-the-shelf functional package that doesn't have any ability to be customized or configured. Only whatever you require to configure to make it run. The category 4 is configured configurable software, where you can set many different types of parameters to different values, features, and functions, and it's configurable, but only within certain constraints. In Category 5, we have custom code, where you have original code that's to meet your specific need. If something is also configured and customized, you can use that as a Category 5. It could be a hybrid combination. That's very often the case. In some cases, the only custom code is an interface to another system, but it's still configured and customized. So with Category 3, the off-the-shelf, out-of-the-box, you want to make sure you audit the vendor and validate the functionality. You want to make sure that you send out at least a vendor questionnaire, and every 2 years check in with them to make sure that they're still practicing things in a way that meets your compliance requirements. You want to look at their practices for how they develop code, how they promote code, how they do patching, how they do updates. All of that should be taken into account. If it's in a service, a cloud service, who's providing that operating system and that server, you want to make sure that their methods for doing all of these things are also in line with your compliance objectives. Category 3 examples of configuration. You might be able to change a report header or a default printer, but beyond that, you can't really do very much. Now, someone's asking about how about if the vendor has compliance certificates. Well, those are nice to have. Those are very good to document in your installation qualification. But you can't rely on the vendor to say that something is validated or meets FDA compliance. You can only gather all the information you have about a particular vendor and use it to support your case that you did due diligence to make sure they're operating the way they should. And with the configurable software, you want to make sure you have good confidence as well. You want to have an audit for the vendor, whether it's a vendor questionnaire or an on-site audit. You want to also validate any configurations that you make to the system and apply the full life cycle set of requirements. And examples of configuration might be drop-down menus that you can customize or specific reports you can create. With Category 5, we have the most complex type of software. It's software that is directly programmed, requiring coding. Any system that requires the new code, even if it was created using non-custom functions within the application, is considered customized. You want to develop this to create new processes or to mimic the processes that you don't want to change in your operation. It's typically not tested by the system supplier and must be thoroughly tested by the user. This is a case where you, as a company, are actually doing customization to the product. You want to audit the vendor and validate all the code and apply full life cycle requirements. So it depends on whether your IT organization is customizing code, writing an interface, or you have a vendor or contractor doing that, or you have some other resource. It doesn't really matter. You just have to make sure they're following good practices. In Category 5, these are one-of-a-kind systems that are used to mimic your functionality, things that you can't live without. And it also includes macros for Excel applications. And that would be the subject of a very limited level of validation, but you would have to have the documentation for that. The categories help you define how much validation testing you're going to do and to what level. And again, in your validation plan, you lay out the risk assessment information, the categories, the size and complexity, and based on that, you describe your rationale for why you're doing the level of testing that you plan to do. The FDA can take issue with that, but as long as you've done due diligence and you can defend it articulately, you should be in a pretty good position. You also want to make sure that you understand how your new system is going to be integrated into your quality processes, into your overall organization, and other systems. So if it's going to be used and the output is being consumed by another system, or you're getting output from another system, Those integration points have to be taken into consideration. Every category has to go through some sort of testing. At least you have to do some sort of IQ, OQ, and PQ. The level of validation is what needs to be determined and is documented in your rationale. And you start with the requirements for the system selection, the URS and then the FRS. So you're really doing your validation plan, at least you're fleshing it out more as you're going through and selecting your system. But you can start with that shell document of a validation from a validation procedure that shows you, here's a template for a plan. This is how you want to fill it out and make sure you cover everything. Now, a mention of software as a service. These are systems that are not implemented on premises. They're licensing and delivery model where the software is licensed on a subscription basis. It's hosted centrally, and that's usually done in the cloud. So that wasn't a thing back when validation started in 1983. There was no such thing as a cloud. So the current computer system validation guidance doesn't address it, specifically at least. But it does tell you have to prove the system does what it purports to do and take every assurance that software is installed properly, is maintained in a validated state, and documenting everything you can to prove that. You want to look at the particular vendor and find out what you can about their practices and procedures. Typically, you can find a lot of information on the internet. A trusted host vendor is a good one to go with, or Amazon Web Services. There are many other options, because there's a wealth of information on the internet that you can use in terms of your documentation, and you can point to those. These vendors are also mature vendors with a very large client base. So you have an historical basis for assuming that their activities would be up to compliance standards. Now, care should be taken with any of these vendors that claim to have a validated software package or application. If a vendor is trying to sell you that, whether it's a SaaS vendor or some other type of vendor, never take that into account and say, well, you know, FDA, we installed this because the vendor told us it was validated. Validation can only be done by your end user company. It has to be based on your specific use of a system, and it has to be tested by your subject matter experts. Anyone marketing their system as a validated system should be looked at very warily. It's a ploy to sell more software to an unsuspecting company, and it's trying to get their edge in the marketplace when, in fact, it's not valid. The CSV process should always be followed as normal. The fact that a SaaS vendor is being used should be documented along with every single step you take to assure that you've mitigated potential risk. So again, your validation plan should be size, complexity, assessed risk, and GAMP5 category. It's your best defense in your approach to CSV when you're being inspected by FDA. Now this is the GAMP5V model, which shows you all the life cycle phases and explains how they're related to each other. So again, you start with your validation plan, your user requirement specification, and FRS, your SDS or your system configuration specification if it's configurable. You develop, customize, configure, or implement your system. You install it and qualify the installation. You do an operational qualification to show it's functioning properly. And then a performance qualification done by your subject matter experts and done in a way that shows it's usable in their environment in the way that they are going to do their work. And after testing reports are done, you have your validation summary report that sums it all up and says, we did everything we said we would do in the plan, and everything was successful. Or if it wasn't and there was any deviation, it's accounted for and explained. The validation plan will also tell you which of the SDLC phases are required. For most applications, all of the ones in the V model will be required. And here you're going to determine who's going to do the work and how it's going to be done. Your validation procedure should give you some direction for that. It should tell you that you have to have specific tests assigned to people. Maybe there's a RACI chart template as an appendix to your procedure that shows you who's responsible, accountable, informed, and consulted for each type of activity that's going on. It should also give you some guidance as to the GAMP5 categories and risk. Your detailed functional requirements are very key to all of your testing. Based on the URS, it's the detail level, and the user has to approve these to make sure that they're in agreement that this is what they want the system to do. Every single requirement should be written in a way that is unique and testable. The key takeaway is that the FRS has to be included in the validation plan as a deliverable, and it should be specified in your CSV procedural content, however you want to define your procedures. The system design spec or configuration spec is the same, except the functional requirements tells you how, the system design tells you how, the functional requirement tells you what the system does, and the system design spec tells you how the functionality is to be done. These should be maintained as current living documents and also signed off by users. Users sometimes don't like to sign these because they feel they're technical in nature, but the meaning of their signature should be that every functional requirement was accounted for in the configuration spec. These should be included as validation plan deliverables again and should be specified in your CSV procedural content. If for some reason you don't have either of these documents, if it's an off-the-shelf package and you don't have anything like this, you still have to include that section and indicate that it's not applicable. Testing is the most critical step of your validation process. Again, you do your IQ on all of your hardware and software, an OQ on the actual code, the application software. Now, if you're custom coding, you might have unit and integration testing done on custom code and then deliver that to your environment, its testing environment, and do your operational qualification on that. Unit and integration testing is that first pass at making sure things work properly. If you're doing, you're also going to do your performance qualification, which should be very specific to the way the system will be used, how it will be executed by users. You can use IQ and OQ test packages that can be purchased from a vendor or contractor. Now, in this case, you're basically taking their packages, their protocols, and they're either going to be executed by the vendor or you can execute them. It'll shorten your time and alleviate the need for internal resources, but it could be costly. So you have to decide how you're going to go about doing this. And if IQ and OQ are done by a vendor or even the protocols are written, you have to make sure that you are reviewing the protocols and the work and that they're acceptable and fitting in with your validation process. In the case of PQ, it has to be executed by the users. You can use external resources to prepare the protocol, the test scenarios and scripts, but user input to those scenarios and scripts is absolutely required and should be documented. Again, execution must be by the users. Also, when you look at software package providers, you want vendors that are mature. They likely have fewer faults in their code. They're likely to have a more robust and mature quality management system of their own. And it's likely that they've been more road tested by other clients. So you're going to have your detailed test plan or protocol, and in your PQ you want to include positive and negative scenarios, not just that the system does what it purports to do, but it doesn't do what it's not supposed to do. And boundary and stress testing, challenge it to the utmost. Follow up on every defect. Make sure that every defect is documented in a defect or deviation or deficiency log at the end of your executed results. That should also be the form of a template. Segregation of duties is critical. You have to both, you have to have people who are going to be separate in terms of their roles, where you have someone writing test scripts, someone executing them, someone reviewing them, and someone approving them. And have a test summary report, either one for each of the IQ, OQ, and PQ stages, or you want to have one for all three stages combined. Now, where someone asked, would you have to validate the IQ and OQ testing packages if you purchase them for a vendor? No, but you want to review them and verify that they do include a thorough assessment of what you're looking for, that the IQ protocol is laying out exactly who's doing what they're doing, how they're doing it, and including everything in there that you would include if you were to write the IQ or OQ package or protocol. You want to make sure the protocols fit within your CSV methodology, that they fit your validation procedure and include all of those elements. You might even have them put that into your own templates. That's not required, but that should be documented somewhere, that these are vendor templates that you've accepted, and there should be a sign-off. Procedural content should include all of these templates: test protocols, execution results matrices where you record your test results, the deviation logs for every protocol, and the test summary reports. These can be the subject of a specific procedure for IQ, a procedure for OQ, a procedure for PQ, or again, you can wrap them all up into one validation procedure. IQ, OQ, and PQ protocols have to be included in the content in your CSV procedures. Now, when you finish your testing, you want to have a requirements traceability matrix. It's a key document the FDA often looks for, and it ties together your requirements, your design, and your testing. You'll have a very simple matrix of 3 columns: requirements, then the design element associated with each, 1 or more design elements per requirement, and then 1 or more test elements per requirement in the 3rd column. It's one of the most critical documents because it shows them that you did in fact test every single function. You should also have this as part of your procedure to show that you have a template for this particular matrix. And there should be some kind of steps on how to complete it and get it approved. Now, for any successful implementation, you have to do careful planning, but you also have to make sure everybody is going to do things properly. You need a detailed training plan, and you should have a procedure for training that's standard in your company. It should also include a training log where you can have people sign off that they've actually attended training. Training should be timed carefully so that you're doing it soon enough that people will be able to understand the system functionality and get used to it before the system goes live, but not so far in advance that they'll forget things. And you want to make it mandatory. It's important that it's assured that people are going to get the right training. Training should also be documented very carefully. Again, the training log should be used. Now note as well, there are 3 types of training. You want training for end users in functionality, but you also want to train anyone involved in validation to understand the validation procedure and how to do specific steps in validation that they're assigned to, such as IQ, OQ, or PQ. You also want to make sure that you do training for people who are going to support the system on an ongoing basis. If your IT organization is the steward of your system, you want to make sure they understand GXPs and FDA compliant documentation. They have to create all of the logs related to access, security, maintenance, change control. Anything related to the system has to be documented. That's part of your annual periodic review to show the system is maintained in a validated state. Now again, your system acceptance form is your contract with your users. The system does what it purports to do. And the notification of release into production indicates the date and time on which data can be collected in a valid way for your system. These 2 should also be deliverables in your validation plan and specified in your computer system validation procedural content. And the final deliverable is your validation summary report, another document that you can either include in your validation plan, in your procedure, or in a separate procedure. But there should be a template for the report, and it should include everything you need to do to show your plan was executed as intended. Any deviations should be explained very clearly. Now, there's a whole set of operational and maintenance support manuals, procedures, scripts that you'll need to maintain this in a validated state. Some of these will be, if you have a cloud server, you're going to have your vendor have many of these things on their site. You might be able to access some of these through the website, through the internet, or you may ask for certain copies of things. You might want to see their disaster recovery system or disaster recovery plan. You want to see how they do backup and archive. You can send them a vendor questionnaire, get those answered, but you might also, if it's a vendor that's not in the cloud, if they're selling a package, you might do a site visit to see how they develop their code and how they promote it from one environment to another, how they do patches and new releases. A key aspect of the whole idea of keeping your system under change control is important for validation maintenance. You want to have a very strict change control process. Typically, a company has this as a separate procedure, but it could also be part of your overall validation procedure. You want to make sure that any change that's made to the system is evaluated just as you would start up a validation plan. You want to look at risk. You want to look at what impact this change is going to have on your existing code. You're going to want to look at some testing to make sure it's working properly. And you may do some regression testing if there's a potential impact on the code that's already been tested. You can reuse those test scripts for regression testing. Every change to the system and to data has to be tracked very carefully. Just as you would have an audit trail for your data, you need a similar audit trail to show changes to the system. Typically, that's all of these documents and logs that your support organization is going to maintain. And again, your IT people or whoever the steward is, they need to understand the FDA compliant environment. Now, also, during the course of your system use, once in production, you want to make sure that if any new interfaces or integration points are brought up, that's considered change control, and they're accounted for. The disaster recovery plan should be in existence. It should be tested. The business continuity plan should be in existence. And you would likely have a procedure, a separate procedure for disaster recovery and for business continuity. Typically, disaster recovery is owned by the IT experts, whereas business continuity is owned by the users or functional experts. But anywhere, at any rate, you need to have these in your CSV procedural content. Procedures, of course, have to be followed to the letter, and you need to have internal audits to make sure people are following those. Policies have to be adhered to. And once your system's in production, you should have a governance board assigned to oversee the validated system, make sure that they are maintaining it in a validated state. This should be organized before the system goes live with clear roles and responsibilities. The board should approve all changes to the system. Every FDA system has to be managed all the way through retirement. So once you retire the system or decide to, look at the retention period for the data. Do you need to archive the data and maintain it? Or is the data outside its retention period and you can retire the system and the data? In a case where the system is no longer needed and the data is no longer needed, the data should be disposed of to avoid any liability. The system documentation, all your validation documentation, should go along hand in hand with the system and the data. If the data is still valid, you want to make sure the documentation is retained. If 10 years from now someone asks you about data that was generated that's still under retention, and you have to point to what system was used and what kind of validation was done, you better have all that documentation handy. But once expired, everything should be disposed of to avoid any questioning about systems that legally the FDA should not be able to do. Now, GXP document principles are very important because you need to know these are legal documents. They're something that could be subpoenaed in a court of law, proving your compliance, providing a full audit trail of everything that you did, demonstrating you did things properly. And this is where the IT organization and support organizations usually fail. At least I've found in a lot of my consulting and a lot of my work, a lot of IT organizations are never brought in under the umbrella of GXP activity where they understand what GXP principles are. They need to understand this to be able to have the right training and skill qualifications showing that they're able to support it in a validated state. They should have resumes and CVs on file and training records to show this, just as any user would for a functional system. There also should be, again, those policies and procedures supporting the fact that they should be trained. Every recording and deviation should be documented very clearly according to how the FDA looks at it. And I'm going to go fast through some of these slides because they're general information. The importance of your documentation being legible, accurate, complete, and accountable. Someone has to be accountable for it. How every page must stand on its own, and you need specific header information. Avoiding cut and paste errors and other types of errors that people make routinely. And there should be a good documentation practice, a good documentation procedure to follow that guides your users through all of this. What kind of writing utensils to use, how to mark things, never to obscure data, data to be legible, no blanks, make sure that cursive or script is reserved only for your signatures. Also make sure you have a signature log. For handwritten signatures, there should be a register showing everyone's signature and their printed name. If it's an electronic signature, the authentication of someone's signature, usually their user ID and password, should be covered. All of that should be documented. Again, you have to defend the meaning of everything you do. When you're recording results, you need to be sure that the results are recorded properly for testing, for example. You want to have a standard date format. You want to correct things properly with one line through incorrect data and then correcting it with your initials, date, and the reason for the correction. Make sure you handle abbreviations and units of measure properly. Acronyms and abbreviations should be defined. And these are just some specific examples of how you can do this type of documentation. Units of measure are important. Decimal places and how you round after you do calculations. How you correct entries. Never superimpose, never obscure raw data. And these are some examples. Here's an example of an incorrect way to do things. The date format is all over the place, different formats. There's a scribble there. You can't see the original data. And not applicable, I guess, is not defined. NA is written, but it's not defined. Here is a correct way of doing something. A bump on a table, something's written incorrectly, and it's corrected properly. Any attachments, should be careful about how you include those in terms of titles of the attachments and references in your table of contents. Again, your procedure should define all this. Any test exceptions are important to know how to record those. If it's a test script error where the script was written incorrectly, you can correct that at the time you're doing the test. Initial date, put the correct information in and indicate it's a test script error. If it's a test error, you executed and recorded the result, but it was not matching your expected result, you want to put that as something where you correct it, show it as a deviation, put a deviation number in your deviation column, and then show on your deviation log that this was a tester error. They did the function improperly, and they retested to show that it was successful. Everything should be explained. If it's something with your software code, you're going to have a little bit more to work to do, because you'll have to go back to your specific vendor or whoever wrote the code, have it corrected, and then you may actually have to do a reinstallation of the application software and retesting. With exceptions, you should have a deviation log that shows every single deviation, discrepancy, deficiency, defect, or exception to testing when actual and expected results don't match. There should be a unique number showing that these are all accounted for, and on the deviation log, each number should show here was the deviation, here was the root cause analysis, the result of that, here's what was done to remediate it, it was retested successfully, and sign off on it. Every defect has to be accounted for before you can sign off on testing. Everything should be done in chronological order, and this should be part of your procedure to say that everything should be done this way. IQ should be done before you start your OQ execution. OQ results should be approved before you start your PQ execution. Functional requirements should be approved before you start your IQ. You also want to make sure you check all of your documentation. Make sure, too, that you're only signing for things that you're accountable for and you know the meaning of your signature. And document retention is important. You have to retain documents according to the retention period, and that should be the subject of another procedure for retention period. It should be defined for your organization. Now, email typically is not accepted as viable documentation unless you print it out and sign and date it saying this is an original document, because email can be changed. So you want to be careful when you're using that as an attachment. Now here we'll go through our last policy checklist for GXP compliance. And again, everything could be covered under one policy for computer system validation. But there are some supporting policies. You need to have one for change control, directing the organization to make sure change is controlled. You want to make sure you have something addressing electronic records and signatures for 21 CFR Part 11, if that applies. You want to have one for asset management. How do you physically and logically secure all of your assets? And security. How do you prevent hacking and things like that? A risk management policy saying that if you're going to do something, you should have some risk management associated with that, or risk assessment. How do you govern your system and your data? Your disaster recovery planning and business continuity planning. How do you manage your vendors, auditing and management on a day-to-day basis? And how do you do good documentation practices? Now this is the procedure checklist. And again, it's just the content I'm talking about here, as long as it's captured. You want a CSV procedure. It could be a specific one. You could have a specific procedure for developing the plan, a procedure for FRS, one for SDS, one for configuration, one for ERES. It depends on how you want to put these together. You might have a unit and integration test procedure in your IT organization if they're coding custom code, an IQ, an OQ, and a PQ test procedure, maybe a protocol that includes the template for recording executed results, your deviation log, and your summary report. You could have one summary report for all three. You could have one procedure that covers all three, as long as you're covering the content. All of your maintenance procedures. How do you do scheduled and unscheduled maintenance? System security, backup data recovery and archival, your periodic review and revalidation, system acceptance and release. How do you manage your configuration and change control? How do you retire your system? Again, disaster recovery and business continuity specific procedures, tracking assets, system documentation, training, tracking, and management, including your training log. All of these are specific to CSV and should be owned by either IT or the business, the subject matter experts. They should all be documented within your quality management system in a controlled area, administered and controlled by the quality organization. And they should be based on standard procedures for writing a policy and writing a procedure, including templates for these, maintained as current and audited to make sure that people are following them. Now, just to talk a little bit briefly about industry best practices, there are many changes that occur that cause us to have to react to them. Regulatory, technology, strategic and tactical business changes, improved processes, workforce changes, customer and market changes, just some examples. The templates will help you because they ensure consistency. They make sure you get your input from subject matter experts. You want to maintain all your policies and procedures as current. You want to respond to any of those regulatory or other types of drivers of change. And you want to use simple language in your procedures and in your policies so that people can easily understand these. There's no ambiguity about it. And you want to make sure you provide training for any new or revised policies or procedures. You want to effectively communicate about documents and where they're located, how they can be accessed and by whom. Centralize the storage of those. Enforce the adherence of following them through audits with consequences. And require employees to report any deviations from practice. These should all be documented. Now, the FDA is looking at a lot of companies in terms of their inspections and audits. And a lot of the findings relate, believe it or not, to poor documentation practices, things that are unforced errors that could easily be avoided. People don't have certain procedures or processes in place, certain policies in place, or they don't follow them to the letter. People don't document things thoroughly. Their validation plan is lacking, insufficient, or it's not documented properly. The wrong people are doing certain things, or the people that are doing them aren't qualified or don't have their qualifications documented. There are so many different areas that FDA is finding a majority of their citations are related to all of these things. So to recap, all of your CSV work should be supported by a policy or a procedure, including the templates that go along with them. Everything you do, you should be able to point back to a policy or a procedure with a straight line of sight to show what it's derived from. The management and storage of these should be controlled under the quality management system. Quality should be your last signature on all of your validation documents, just as all of your policies and procedures. Adherence should be assured through audits with consequences. Employees should document carefully what they're doing. They make sure that if an event or a task is related to something that's regulated by FDA, that they know who, what, when, where, why, or how it was done, that it's very clear. You might be asked about something 10 years from now, and you want to be able to go back and say, yeah, this is what happened, and I know that because it's documented so clearly. You don't want to be guessing what happened when the FDA is inspecting it. And documentation is your absolute best defense during an FDA inspection. You want to make sure everything is documented properly, and again, there's that clear line of sight back to each procedure and then to each policy to state what you need to do and how you need to do it. Now that concludes the presentation portion, and we can now go to Q&A.